Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation with our 2021 Innovator Fellows and Dr. Charles Jaffe, the CEO of HL7. We'll give people just a couple minutes to join. While they're joining, I'll go ahead and start with our intro about who we are, what we do, and then cover a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into the presentations today. So I am Laura Sconyers. I'm the program manager here at Cambia Grove. At Cambia Grove, we serve as a catalyst to transform healthcare towards a more person-focused and economically sustainable system. And we do this through collaboration with the 5 points of healthcare: the patients, payers, providers, policymakers, and purchasers, as well as with other aligned stakeholders and innovators. Our goal is to drive transformation by optimizing 3 key elements of the healthcare ecosystem, and those are infrastructure, incentives, and culture. As part of this work, we zeroed in on data interoperability as a critical component of the infrastructure that's required to drive healthcare transformation. And in 2018, the concept behind this fellowship program was developed to enable innovators to take a deep dive into data interoperability and take on high priority projects and ultimately share those learnings with the community. So this year's fellowship is in partnership with the HL7 Fire Accelerator program. So this includes the Argonaut project, the Karen Alliance, Codex, the Gravity Project, Da Vinci Project, and Vulcan. The Innovator Fellows worked to develop, vet, and standardize a framework for measuring the value of use case implementation, otherwise known as the Value Metrics Framework, which you'll hear more about today. These 6 outstanding fellows conducted interviews with subject matter experts from across the HL7 Accelerator community. And through this process, they have identified many questions about interoperability itself, the importance of this work, and have uncovered some barriers to adoption. So we're excited to hear from them as they present what they learned through their experience and their conversations. So they will share the Value Metrics Framework and how this can be used as a tool to capture the value of use case implementation and explore what next steps they recommend to move this work forward. So we have time reserved later in the event for audience Q&A to ask more about the fellows' work and to hear from Dr. Jaffe. I invite you to use the Q&A box that's located at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and if we're not able to answer your question today, you can always reach out to us. We're happy to answer that through email as well. So finally, this event is being recorded. So each attendee here today will receive the link via email, along with a recap blog post, and the recording will be housed on our website in addition to the fellows' work. So the Value Metrics Framework and their summaries of their work will live on our website as well. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our featured guest speaker. Here with us today is Dr. Charles Jaffe, the Chief Executive Officer of Health Level 7 International, or HL7. Dr. Jaffe completed his medical training at Johns Hopkins and Duke universities and postdoc training at the National Institutes of Health and the Lombardi Cancer Center. Dr. Jaffe has served in various academic positions in the departments of medicine and pathology, as well as in the School of Engineering. Prior to joining HL7, he was the senior global strategist at Intel. In addition, he led a national research consortium, founded a consultancy for research informatics, served as the VP of Medical Informatics at AstraZeneca and the VP of Life Sciences at SAIC. Currently, he's the visiting scholar at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Jaffe has been the contributing editor for several journals and has published on clinical management, informatics deployment, and healthcare policy. We are so thrilled that he has joined us today to share a bit about HL7 and what we can look for from HL7 in the future. Dr. Jaffe, over to you.
Thanks, Laura. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Cambia Grove in particular for establishing this program and for allowing the fellows to investigate some of the opportunities around the interoperability opportunities that FHIR affords them. But in addition, I want to congratulate the fellows for some remarkable work that you'll hear about in detail later. For a few minutes, I'd like to discuss HL7 Fire and what it looks like today and what we hope to see in the near future. May I have the first slide, please? More than a decade ago, I was introduced to the idea of the API economy. Application programming interfaces are what drive healthcare today, but for decades, it's enabled the sharing of information in business, transportation, commerce, and social media. Next slide, please. In 2011, we met for the first time in the Fresh Look Task Force. We wanted to understand how HL7 could be re-envisioned to enable the more effective exchange of healthcare information, not only for patients and providers, but also for public health, for research, and for the broad communities that demand this information. Next slide, please. Fast healthcare interoperability was born from that vision and serves as really a hub for not only the standards to meet the technical needs, but also the business needs of healthcare information. Next slide, please. In more than a decade since FHIR first emerged, there have been some critical moments in its life. I think the first of these was perhaps the report of the Gerson task force, which identified open APIs as the critical step for interoperability. Shortly thereafter, the Argonaut project was born, which was a private consortium to drive FHIR adoption globally. It wasn't long after that ONC required in its certification program open APIs to enable electronic health records to share information. Within a very short time, the implementation of FHIR began to accelerate exponentially. I think one of the seminal steps was the integration of the Argonaut implementation guide directly into the Apple operating system, which provided patients the ability to aggregate their health information, laboratory data, and imaging in a single platform. Over the ensuing years, FHIR has emerged as an important requirement not only for healthcare, but also for CMS. Both ONC and CMS have named FHIR requirements in their final rules. Next slide, please. The Argonaut project implementation guide, which became the cornerstone for the Apple Health Kit, has exploded globally and is now used worldwide for the basis for sharing information, not only in patient care, but also in research and public health. Next slide, please. ONC and CMS are not alone in their adoption of FHIR. The FDA is now undergoing real-world clinical trials using FHIR. The National Library of Medicine and NIH now require FHIR implementation in their extramural grants. And of course, the growing need for the CDC to use fire for sharing public health information. Next slide, please. 3 years ago, the big 6 cloud providers announced publicly that they would use fire to exchange information between their healthcare clouds. And more recently, bulk data on fire, which enables the exchange of large cohorts of information from perhaps hundreds of thousands of patients into and out of the cloud for such operations as analytics and risk assessment. Next slide, please. We couldn't have gotten there by understanding only what had been in the past. We looked forward with an imaginative view of how fire could transform interoperability in a broad global scale. Next slide, please. With that, the Fire Accelerator program was born. The first of these, of course, was the Argonaut project, but Da Vinci enabled a unique group of payers and providers to collaborate for the first time and recognize that granular clinical data was necessary for payers if they were to become more successful in improving care and reducing costs. Codex was founded to identify fire APIs for use in not only research, but also cancer patient care. Karen Alliance served as a cornerstone for patients and payers to share information, and hallmarked by the Blue Button program from CMS. Gravity was a remarkable step forward to identify the data elements of social determinants of health and to apply those elements, which are so critical in healthcare delivery. By some estimates, 40% of healthcare outcomes are related to social determinants. And more recently, Vulcan, which is a public-private partnership for research, both regulated and non-regulated, and an enormous global step forward. Next slide, please. 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of announcing the Helios project from CDC, an opportunity to share public health information more broadly, both with agencies and providers, to not only inform the CDC, but to provide better patient care. Next slide, please. FAST project was developed as an ONC effort to create infrastructure for fire. Soon, FAST will become the most recent of the fire accelerators, and we'll have a shared platform for all the existing accelerators and accelerators to come. Next slide, please. 2 of these accelerators, which are on the near horizon, include a clinical fire accelerator where people who provide healthcare on the front lines influence the information that's exchanged and the goals of a broader health community. Lastly is a genomics accelerator, which is really integral for the success of precision medicine. If we're to provide care that's based on more than anatomic and clinical information, the integration of genomics at the point of care is critical. Next slide, please. For those of you who are focused on research, in February, HL7 announced that we had developed a partnership with Odyssey. We will enable fire resources to be used as within the OMOP data model and really serve as a framework for sharing information from scientific and clinical communities. Next slide, please. May I have the next slide, please? I think one of the exciting outcomes that I wanted to show you was the digital certificates for COVID vaccination. This is mine. This QR code embeds not only my COVID immunization records, but is capable of having URLs that point to my clinical information, my past medical records, my, of course, immunization status, imaging, and laboratory. This is now live throughout the United States, Canada, and other countries. Next slide, please. Laura wanted me to address what's ahead, and I think this is exciting not only for the Cambia community, but also for the larger healthcare ecosystem. Next slide, please. HL7 has announced that we will introduce a new division, a new implementation division. For 35 years, HL7 has been developing standards, but it's clear within the past 4 or 5 years that much of the work we do is around fire implementation. This division will work hand in glove with the standards development division at HL7 and create a real standards ecosystem that will allow those that implement fire to be validated and to have an environment in which they can support one another. Last slide, please. I thought I was having a visual seizure there. So I wanted to stress that the implementation division is really a broad effort with many partners and many collaborators. People have mistaken the notion of division. We'll divide work and not people. It will take time for this division to be successful, but we welcome the contributions of all of you, not only on this call, but those global partners that want to foster the HL7 vision. So I have the last slide, Laura. If you'd like to reach out, I'm a really good email correspondent. Please send me a note, drop me your questions, offer advice and solace. Thanks again, Laura, and thank you, Cambia Grove.
Chuck, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and sharing information, not just about HL7 and what you're doing today, but also what's coming for the future. How exciting that there are 2 new accelerators and a new HL7 implementation division. No doubt, these are important initiatives that will continue to support the standards ecosystem and continue to advance interoperability and forward progress. So on behalf of our fellows and the team here at Cambia Grove, again, we appreciate your support of our Innovator Fellows, their work, and for joining us today as they share their findings. For all of you in the audience, Dr. Jaffe will be on the call for the entirety today. So as we get to the end, please feel free to send questions his way through the Q&A box, in addition to those for our fellows. So An effort such as this one would not have been possible without support from HL7, each of the Accelerator projects, and from our other key members of the Cambia Grove community who participated on our steering committee and really helped shape and drive this work forward. This started, back in the spring and has just really been a monumental effort and has been backed by support from a number of people to make this possible. I would personally like to thank Kirk Anderson and Dave DeGandy, who originally brought this idea to the table as the focus for this year's program. Dave has been involved with this effort from the beginning and worked with the fellows on an almost daily basis as they conducted their interviews and prepared their data to be shared with the public, and helped provide some structure to this work to ensure that it's a useful work product. So as you'll hear, each of our fellows bring a different and unique perspective to this work. And this year's project was no simple task. For the first time ever, all HL7 Fire Accelerator projects were able to collaborate on a single effort, which was largely made possible through the work of these fellows, through their time and expertise. So I have worked alongside this group here today on the fringes to ensure that this program runs, and have truly been nothing short of impressed by their expertise and their commitment to advancing interoperability, and their dedication to ensuring that this work is something that is a useful foundation that can continue to be expanded upon. So without further ado, I would like to invite this year's fellows to join me on stage. So if you would all turn on your videos, come to the virtual stage. Hello, great to see all of you. Congratulations. Here we are at the end where we get to share this work with the community. So what I'd like to do is invite each of you to introduce yourselves really quickly before we dive into the presentation. So if you could tell us who you are, what you do, and kind of your takeaways from this year's fellowship program. And let's see, I will start with Sherry.
Good afternoon, I'm Sherry Cutler. I'm a registered nurse at Pullman Regional Hospital. My title is Assistant Director of Clinical Informatics. So I've focused, excuse me, a lot of my professional time in quality and risk and implementing systems. I've worked for some software companies, so have enjoyed my time with the group of fellows, and it's kind of sad to see it coming to an end, but I've really enjoyed the collaboration and just learning a lot about fire and the standards and just what's coming up in the industry.
Thank you, Sherry. Steve.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Lamb, and I'm a clinical pharmacist by training. I'm actually a new employee to Microsoft, so I'm currently their pharmacy program manager. But prior to joining Microsoft, I spent 5 years at Regence Health Plans in the state of Washington, where I really had direct oversight on a lot of our key strategic pharmacy accounts within the state and helping them manage their pharmacy benefits, which, as we all know, it's a huge bucket of money and is continuing to grow. But this fellowship really was an opportunity for me to learn something new, and get outside of my comfort zone. As a pharmacist, I've always been fascinated with technology and how we can really leverage it to solve some very complicated healthcare problems. And what I got out of this was just a really good group of people that I got to network with, including the fellows and all the people I interacted with. So we're excited to share everything with you guys today.
Thank you, Steve, and congrats on the new role. Sarah.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Green, and I'm a health services researcher by background, currently working as a consultant both to Kaiser Permanente and also to the National Academy of Medicine. And, I became interested in data standards and interoperability like 20 years ago when working with health systems that were working on a federated data warehouse for research. And just seeing the inordinate amount of work that went into that and creating research-ready detail was really made very vivid to me. So I've been excited about data harmonization and interoperability for years, and mostly in the space of common data models and data sharing and federated research networks. And it was interesting to refract Dr. Jaffe's comments. We figured out all the basic blocking and tackling around interoperability, but knowing now that the implementation and sociocultural interoperability, that we can really meet the needs of all of the stakeholders that are part of the healthcare ecosystem, that was probably one big takeaway for me. Like, how do we really go about that integration of interoperability and the culture and operations of care? And then I think the second takeaway is just having worked with all of these fellows who have a much more technical background than I do, really appreciating the technical intricacies of interoperability more than ever before. I'm just still trying to wrap my head around things like implementation guides. And so it's been a great experience. So thanks to Cambia Grove.
Thank you, Sarah. I can echo your feelings on the listening to those with the more technical backgrounds. Grace. Speaking of technical backgrounds.
Speaking of technical backgrounds, hi, I'm Grace. I am a software developer, which may be kind of more technical than clinical, definitely. I used to work at Epic on their social determinants of health module, and then I got sidetracked by natural language processing research at UW. So that's where I am right now. I'm completing my master's degree here. And during this master's degree, I really wanted to get involved with FHIR because I see it as sort of the next big problem in the EHR space. And I saw this fellowship as a really great way to meet a lot of people who are also interested in FHIR, but from that clinical side, which honestly I have no idea about. And so this, for me, the biggest takeaway from this fellowship would probably be just the sheer amount of social issues that need to be solved in order for an implementation to occur, both on a within the department, within the system, as well as between systems. And that aspect I hadn't really considered before. So it was really enlightening. And I really want to thank Cambia for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Grace. Rachel.
Okay, hi everybody. My name's Rachel Gerson. I'm a practicing radiologist here in Washington, and I'm also a consultant in artificial intelligence applications in radiology and on health innovation initiatives in the broader healthcare ecosystem. And much as others have said, just like radiology sits at the intersection of many clinical pathways and information systems, my interests lie in that space between innovative ideas, their technical development and application, and the actual clinical goals and realities, which often don't line up. And the challenges in working with the EHR and medical data are part of my day-to-day clinical life. So participating in this fellowship, much like Sarah mentioned, is an opportunity to have insight into the challenges of achieving data interoperability as well as the potential. And I've been so inspired in the use cases and groups that I got to interview and talk with. I've been so inspired by the cross collaboration across a wide range of participants and stakeholders, regulators, researchers, clinical people, really tech experts, and to see their excitement and enthusiasm working towards interoperability and their optimism that we can achieve this, and seeing the real clinical and research potential of usable and accessible data sharing. So.
Thank you, Rachel. I love the point that you just made about usable and accessible data sharing. We'll definitely be getting into that. And last but not least, Chris.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Boyd, and I work for the Washington State Healthcare Authority, which is the, among other things, the Medicaid payer for Washington State. My role within the agency is actually leading the team that develops the enterprise data warehouse for the agency, which is a space that I've worked in for most of my career. This is a space that really hasn't gotten deeply entwined with FHIR and interoperability standards yet, but it's actually something that interests me quite a lot because, well, it's one of my favorite tricks is to go find something that people built for a totally different purpose and figure out how it's useful in my area. And I think that standards often end up that way, where we have a particular problem we're trying to solve and we design it for that, and it's great. And then if you just think about it, you're like, well, I have a square solution here and I have a square problem over there, and I'm going to see if I can make it work. It doesn't always. So there's a little bit of risk and investment that you have to make there. But with FHIR becoming the interoperability standard in healthcare and working in healthcare data, at this point, it seems like everybody in this space needs to be investing this time. So I was really grateful, like the rest of the fellows have said, just for the opportunity to get exposed to what the community looks like, what these implementation standards look like, how they're coming about these decisions, and also just becoming, so aware of how open this community is that, really it's for whoever wants to try and get involved. You can find a place and participate. I think that's been really encouraging just to learn all of that.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I still, when I hear you all talk about your experience and your background, and just amazed at the breadth of experience and expertise in this group. It's truly incredible. So thank you all for, again, being here today and participating in this year's program. All right. At this time, I'd like to turn the mic over to Grace and followed by Chris for a brief presentation on what it is you've spent the last 4 months working on. Grace, take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Laura. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I do have the privilege of walking you through the why behind our final project, while Chris has the privilege of walking you through the actual spreadsheet itself. So really, what is the why, right? So before the fellowship, we partnered with several FHIR accelerators. You've heard their names, Argonaut, Da Vinci, and we asked them some simple questions. If you had the resources, what would you do in our shoes? What would be the most valuable use of our time? And they told us what that or cheat sheet, you might call it, that maps out the value propositions for different accelerator APIs. For example, if I wanted to implement a specific API, clinical decision support hooks is my favorite. I would need to convince maybe a provider, administrators in order to implement, but I'm not a provider, I'm not an administrator, so I have no idea what the most important value is to them. I can speak technical babble all I want, and that won't actually get me anywhere. Alternatively, if I were a provider and I wanted to get better at population health management, but I wasn't sure, where to start, what APIs would even be involved, how do I start? What APIs are most important to me that would have the best benefit, specifically around, gaps in care, for example. In practice, what that actually meant was each of us interviewed several people, ranging from providers at the bedside to software developers to payer administrators to researchers, and we asked them, for these APIs that are most valuable to them, that are most meaningful to them, why are they valuable? And then we also asked them to put themselves in the shoes of other stakeholders that rely on those APIs, and how is it valuable to those stakeholders versus to them. So if they're a payer, how would it be valuable to provider, and vice versa. The output of this was many, many, many pages of notes. They were in all sorts of formats. They were scribbled, they were in docs, and we had to somehow figure out how to synthesize them and streamline them into some kind of spreadsheet or cheat sheet form that could be used as a foundation for future work. This was the hardest part, frankly. It took several weeks to organize all these points of value into indexable themes. We tried to focus on points of value that were either A, present across many different APIs, or B, were extremely important to a specific API and stakeholder combination. We then mapped out for each point of value what stakeholders benefit, and of all the APIs that we wanted to focus on, from Argonaut to Da Vinci to Karen, which ones would be applying and which ones wouldn't. So this output then is now in this magical spreadsheet that we can use for future work. It's really this foundational data structure that we can use in other more user-friendly displays. Part of the issue is that because the uses of the data vary so much, we do really need thoughtful displays of the information on top to target different audiences, to target a developer audience versus provider audience. They have different things they care about, different ways to interact with the spreadsheet. But really, we think this is a great first step to that work. And I'd like to hand this over now to Chris, who will walk everyone through the spreadsheet using a specific use case.
Thank you, Grace. I am sharing my screen, and I think you can all see it now. I've got a notification, but in case you can't, somebody should unmute and scream. So here it is, ta-da! So it took 6 very smart people, 3.5-ish months to come up with a spreadsheet, which, in case you're not impressed by that, what I would kind of point out is that one of the biggest challenges that we immediately ran into was just trying to figure out how to think about all of this different work. So the numerous different accelerators that were involved, and you know, as Chuck was pointing out, the new ones that are being added, you know, by the week. As an implementer, somebody who wants to come and actually start using FHIR and building this standard into their systems, how do you even begin? Because, you know, we had to interview numerous people, we had to comb through various websites. So this value metrics framework, in addition to other ways it could be used, we really see it as a map, as a way for you to be able to connect from your particular point of view, whatever that might be, to try and find out what are the implementations that you might actually want to use with FHIR. So for our example here, what we chose is we're going to pretend that we're just a small independent provider. So we're not, you know, these enormous multi-state, you know, millions of patients kinds of organizations. We're not Google or Apple doing their massive health work. We're talking a much more, you know, small town kind of provider. And they have problems that are very, very common across the industry. The one that we chose is, as a provider, I don't know when my patients are being admitted to the hospital. So I don't know when I should be doing something to help them to reach out. I also don't know that there is clinical information that I need to get from that hospital. And I certainly can't manage this at the population level. You know, there's all these issues with information transmission where your primary care provider, who may have every desire to actually connect all this information and connect all these dots together to help you, their patient, is not able to do it for technical reasons. So that's the example that we're using. Is we say, I just need to be able to figure out how to manage my population better. You know, as a provider, I don't have enormous IT resources to throw at this development to create new interoperability standards. And I certainly don't have the resources to dedicate 3 months and 6 people to trying to figure out which implementation guide even to look at. So that's how we're going to use this metric to try and make a map as a shortcut to getting to those right implementation guides. So for our example here, what we're going to do is take advantage of some spreadsheet magic. And first off, we're just going to try and limit the list, because I'll show you here. This is 159 items long, which is pretty long. Most of us don't have the attention span to go through all of that. So we're just going to start by saying, you know, what is my perspective? So our perspective is we're a clinical provider. And so we're going to expand this stakeholders column that we had collapsed here. And we're going to say, I want the value that is beneficial to a clinical provider, because that's what I am. That's what I'm interested in today. And then just for space saving, we're going to close this again. So now the list has gotten a lot shorter, but it's still pretty long. That's 121. So better, but still not great. So the next place that we would actually encourage people to go to when they're trying to whittle down this list is, what's the general description of the value that you're trying to get? And this is a list that was the result of the fellows doing a lot of consolidation. And so we came up with it was probably close to 160 different types of value. And then the fellows really tried to whittle this down so that it was a list that was short enough that you might actually be able to read it. But also, again, with some Excel magic, you can say, oh, I'm dealing with population health, and do some filtering. And turns out we've got one in here around enabling management of population health. So we're going to whittle down our list a bit more. So now this is looking a lot more manageable. This is small enough that I actually feel okay, like I could go through this one at a time and think about this particular problem that I'm trying to solve. And so, you know, we were saying, I don't know when my patients are getting treated. And so maybe that means, yeah, I'm redoing work. I found out that the labs that I ordered had already been done 2 days before. So we've got something around this in particular. And if we follow this over, and I'm just going to quickly highlight just so you all can track a little easier. If we follow this over to this area and start expanding these, we can take a look. It looks like we didn't ping any there for Argonaut. Oh, shoot. Let me just expand this whole thing. Apologies. There we go. So I've gone all the way over to the right and I found one of these use cases, which is basically something that we've said, you know, for this particular point of value, this particular use case, this implementation, we think it actually speaks to that value. And you can keep going over and see, you know, for some there's not many, for some there's quite a few. So here's another one where we said allows proactive approach to, you know, addressing patient needs. We go over and we can see another link here. Now this one is to the CDS hooks. I don't think I've got my screen set up to actually follow these links through, so I'll spare you all the switching back and forth. But the idea here is that we're making it a very short path for you to, from your perspective, look at these values, zero in on the one that you really think is important, and then get connected both with the Accelerator project. So whether that be Argonaut or Vulcan or one of the new ones, which will hopefully soon get added to this. And then zero in on those particular use cases that they've identified and that they're developing implementation guides for. And from that point, of course, there's still plenty of work to actually implement it. But at the very least, what we've done is we've shortened that pathway so that you can see pretty quickly, does something out there already exist? And I will stop there.
Thank you, Chris and Grace, for that great overview of this work. I think one thing, Chris is showing one way that this Excel sheet can be approached and viewed, but there are a number of other perspectives to approach it. And so if we went into all of those, we could be here for a really long time. So this will live on our website. So you're able to take a look at the spreadsheet. And then obviously, if there's questions about it or you want to get further involved within the HL7 community or this work, there are opportunities for that as well. So thank you again for that presentation. I would like to invite everyone to come join me back on stage. And what we'll do next is just kind of participate in some discussion about the experience, the work, and what you see as the future of interoperability. So I'd like to, since we've already done our introductions, let's go around the room quickly and just share which accelerator or accelerator projects you worked with, and just briefly share what you believe the potential is for that accelerator or those accelerators to transform the healthcare system. Let's see, I will start with Sherry.
I had Da Vinci accelerators. I had 3 use cases. So I had risk adjustment, so closing gaps in chronic care, coverage requirements, so identifying potential missing documentation or codification from various, could be from medications or previous procedures, and also improving the payer coverage, and that was payer to payer. So really having a complete clinical information, leading to better ways to get prior authorization, reducing duplicate services. And so all 3 really focused on improving that accuracy between providers and payers, closing those care gaps. I think I really brought the bias of being a clinician to the value of these. I could really empathize with the administrative burdens that we all have. So I think, you know, overall, just supporting the lower cost of care by having accurate data, being able to really, if I had to summarize it, it would be to really support that patient-centered care. You really could really know what's fully going on with your patient with all this information. So it was great to talk to people. Everybody, I think, depending on who the stakeholder was, really brought their own focus, which was really fun.
Thank you, Sherry. That's great. Steve, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, sounds good. So for my fellowship project, I worked also with Da Vinci as well as with the Karen Alliance, and my focus areas were for the payer data exchange, clinical data exchange, Blue Button, as well as the real-time pharmacy benefit check. And so I think when we're looking at healthcare and hear from some of the top leaders there, whether you're listening to HIMSS or HLTH, which I think happened last week or this week, I think we keep hearing the same buzzwords, right? We need healthcare to be more disruptive, need to be more patient focused. They have to be at the center of the care delivery model and really focusing on that N of one. So in thinking about the use cases that are assigned to, I think it has the potential to satisfy all of these important areas. And specifically to the Blue Button and real-time pharmacy benefit check, I think if we can use the FHIR-based APIs, we can then deliver more custom, more tailored and meaningful information to our patients. And a lot of what we currently see and use today in third-party apps, point solutions, or even health plans where, the space that I used to live in with care gap closures is very singular in nature, and they really act independently of the entire ecosystem. So, as you can imagine, that generates an unfathomable and inordinate amount of healthcare data out there and doesn't make for a very coordinated experience. So I think the idea of being patient focused is nice. I think it's very important. But I think in order for this all to work, we need to have that ecosystem really communicate with one another. And I think that's really the true potential of what FHIR, what interoperability really has for this entire project and for the whole ecosystem as a whole. So I think there's a lot of new and innovative ways to think about this moving forward. And we're just really at the beginning stages of what this could all mean. So.
Thank you, Steve. Sarah.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting kind of a twist on what Steve said, I think, in a way. So I worked with Codex and Gravity, which focus on oncology and social determinants of health, respectively. And again, my background's in research and learning health systems, and my undergrad's in psychology. So that's kind of the lens I often tend to view things through is with a little bit of a, kind of what's the social psychology of all of this. And so when I think about these use cases and their potential for healthcare transformation, and my family and friends will tell you, I think about this a lot. I think about the fact that health and healthcare are always going to be multidimensional and multi-stakeholder and multi-system, right? And complex and different for everybody. So the phenomenal thing about these accelerators is that they engage a broad spectrum of clinicians and patients and payers, vendors, standards developers, the whole spectrum. And that getting everybody together in a virtual room or a room is, to me, that's the only way we're really going to meaningfully transform healthcare, not with entities working in silos or, vendors here and patients over there. So you can tell I'm a huge proponent of bringing diverse constituents together, which is what these two accelerators do. And they include patients and families and frontline clinicians. And so to me, that's what's going to really help us move toward positive changes.
Yes, Sarah, could not agree with you more. Thank you for that. Grace.
I had Argonaut and Da Vinci. Argonaut, I had data query, clinical decision support hooks, which is my favorite, which I will get into in a bit. And then from Da Vinci, I had gaps in care and notifications. Gaps in care deals with care gaps and managing the data. And I would say like the biggest thing would have been that there is a lot of work that has to be done in order to make something intuitive and easy to use and implementable in a short time frame. And part of why I really like clinical decision support hooks is because it has a lot of that framework and extra infrastructure available as a developer that I can go in and read it and understand it pretty quickly and implement it and play with the playground and things like that. And like from all the interviews, that was really the biggest thing that seemed to happen was, we think this is so great. We're a little lost trying to figure out the value, but then once we found an API to implement, we're also really lost trying to implement it and trying to really decrease that cost as much as possible. So it's not like a betting the farm situation where you only have that one chance, one opportunity to do that FHIR implementation. And so that was my biggest issue or theme that kept coming up between the two.
Great. Thank you, Grace. Rachel, what about you?
So I worked on 2 use cases from Argonaut and 3 use cases from Vulkan. And Argonaut is much one of the first accelerator with a lot more foundational and kind of tech side, I would say, pieces. And there I worked on clinical notes and provenance. So provenance is just the idea that all the pieces of data in the medical record are tagged with who put them there and when. That doesn't sound so revolutionary, but in fact it is, and really foundational. And clinical notes is the idea that you can find data kind of no matter what form it's in, whether it comes directly from the lab into the EHR or whether it's a scanned PDF of a lab result from somewhere else, that kind of idea. So those are sort of building block pieces that support more clinically focused use cases, as well as other use cases as well. And then Vulkan, until I guess just the last week or so, was the newest accelerator, but I come to find out there are 2 newer ones. And the use cases I worked on there were medical or medicine identification, which is just the idea that you could, certain medications, we think, I was sort of surprised to learn this, and Steve probably has more insight into this than I do, but we know that there are brand names and generic names, but there are also differences in generic names across countries, not for all medicines, but for some. So the idea that you could identify medication that people are taking, no matter what it's called, and know which medicine they're taking. Phenopackets, which is probably one of the newer and least earliest stage use case, which is really driven by clinical research into rare genetic diseases, which can often be identified or suspected based on phenotypic or visual features that a person has. And that data is hard to or it's not captured in a standard way in the medical record. So what's interesting, I think, about this use case is the idea that they're trying to impose a structure into the clinical record, not just how do we pull this out, but how do we put data in so that it fits, so that it's easier to find in the future. So, and this has real clinical applications for research, for academics, for pharmaceutical industries, because rare diseases are often the place where you make discoveries that are applicable to broader diseases. And the work right now of finding that information is all hand done. People comb pages and pages of records looking for patients who have certain features, that kind of thing. And the implementation of this use case also really has the potential to aid in early diagnosis. And the last one was schedule of activities, which I thought was a super interesting one. And it's really a collaboration between regulators, the FDA, pharmaceutical industry, clinical researchers, clinical practitioners, and developers. And it's the idea that if you're enrolled in a clinical trial, that the schedule of points within the clinical trial, you need to get labs on this day, you need to have imaging on this day, you need to have a reevaluation on this day, be again integrated in a structured way into the clinical record. So it's easy to track who's met all their benchmarks. It's easy to make sure that people do. It's easy to figure out who should be enrolled in a clinical trial. It's easy to track adverse events. So real practical hands-on clinical real world applications for data interoperability that I thought were super exciting. Again, these are in their early stages, but and I think one of the interesting things was the struggle that was highlighted, particularly on the Phenopackets group, with articulating the clinical need to the technical people, which again is kind of not everybody's speaking the same language all the time. And I think that that is part of the exciting part of this fellowship, and even just within our fellows group, learning to have a shared language between us.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. That shared language has been something in progress throughout this fellowship. So, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. So I worked on 2 accelerators. I was working with Karen on the digital insurance card use case, which is still actually very early stages, but it's effectively the insurance card you get mailed to you, having a digital representation of that in a standard way so that it can be done the same way across payers. the other project I was with was Argonaut. And I think, gosh, let me see if I can go through the list. We were doing the subscriptions use case, the smart app launch, bulk data. I'm sure I'm leaving one out. But to speak a little bit about, I'll talk more about Argonaut since I had a lot more work with them. The thing that I found really exciting about that Accelerator is, as one of those technical people, so not a clinical person, I think clinical people are like, solve my problems today. And this is exactly what it is. Go solve that. As a tech geek, I get really excited when I see the very foundational type of work that the accelerator like Argonaut is doing, because they're building these little pieces. So instead of a great big plastic castle, it's Legos, and you get to build a castle yourself. And some people don't like that, but I actually get really excited by it because it means I don't have to build a castle. I can also build a boat. And so, having these use cases around APIs that, can even be used to kind of build on each other, you can feasibly go from where we are today to, I'm going to implement 4 APIs and it's going to tie into public health systems and pull my whole population health data. And it's going to integrate directly in with my EMR so that I can see all this information. And I'm also going to tie it into a subscription so that it tells me on my pager every single time that changes. These kinds of things start to become possible. And it's really exciting because right now, I think there's a lot of patterns and behaviors that we follow in healthcare because we have to, because we've sort of been boxed in and we just can't even imagine doing things a better or different way. But when you start to make the ease of implementing different workflows, you start to come up with creative ideas that no one ever would have thought before. So, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Just as you were all talking, it's so fascinating to hear about each of the accelerator projects and what they're focusing on. And many of you got to work with more than one project. And so I'm curious to hear from one or two of you if, so these projects seemingly work on such different things. Obviously everyone's working towards interoperability, but how are they related? Who wants to start?
I mean, I can start, I guess, because for mine, it was very lucky because the Argonaut, the clinical decision support hook API is very foundational and not really content driven, as well as the data query API, which is basically, pulling allergies and vitals and basic information like that. And so those are sort of the foundational blocks. And then the Care Gaps API and the other DaVinci APIs sort of require those foundations to be present in order to do it, not necessarily based on the implementation guide, but you can do it that way. So what's really been interesting to see is just the sheer overlap, like in terms of the technical side. The content might be different, but every part of the industry is experiencing very similar problems.
Thank you, Grace.
Yeah, I'll just add that, the Codex use case I worked on was specifically around an integrated clinical trial matching service. So improving the ability to match people with cancer to clinical trials. And then Gravity, which, as I mentioned, is focused on social determinants of health. Those use cases were centered on the collection and exchange of data between clinicians and community-based organizations. So on the face of it, at surface level, you might not see those connections immediately, but to me, the relationship is that both of them were seeking to decrease complexity and increase the chance of getting your most critical needs met. So, if you can use standardized common data elements and sift through enormous volumes of EHR data to address a clinical need of getting the best possible cancer treatment or getting stable housing or food security needs met, I think that to me was the thread, is this need to do everything that we can do with the data at our disposal to decrease complexity, increase the chances of better health and healthcare.
That's great. Thank you.
No.
Oh, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, I can just add one piece just in the kind of because I worked on Argonaut, which had some foundational building blocks, and Vulcan, which is much more expansive in its goals. And for me, again, I referenced this a little bit, but the idea of clinical notes was really instructive to me. I didn't really understand that use case at the beginning. But the idea that information is in the EHR in a variety of formats. So if you want to be looking through the EHR to find out if someone has had the labs they need for their clinical trial, you need to look not just under labs within your healthcare system, but in written notes or in something that might be uploaded from an outside system, in just an image, PDF format, that kind of thing. So those Argonaut use cases allow you to create a next level up search through the data. And so I think that for me, that was really instructive to see, oh, this is why these really tech-sided use cases, why they're challenging, and also why they're so important, because they allow us to do these other systems that, from a clinical perspective, is what we want to achieve.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Or if I could just finally add too, I loved Chris's analogy around the castle and the Lego building blocks, because I think we heard a lot from a lot of these fellows here is there's the foundational component, right, which is really those large Lego pieces, but then we also have very small modular pieces that might be like a CDS hub. So if we're thinking about how do we make these things work together, it is important that they all fit in with one another, because one, you don't want to reinvent the wheel every single time. And so there's a lot of cross-pollination that could happen between use cases and even between accelerators. So I think the more that I was investing my time in learning about this stuff, the more that I found out is there is a lot of cross-pollination that's already happening, but that's ultimately what's going to allow this all to work. Because if we're all siloed and trying to solve our individual use cases, we're not going to achieve the ultimate goal, which is interoperability. So it was just fascinating that how that organically just kind of came about as we were going through the process.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And there's a common theme here that silos don't work. Silos are not the way to go. It truly takes, a village. It takes everyone communicating and coming together. So that's great. Thank you all for chiming in there. So Grace and Chris explained kind of what the value metrics framework is and the methodology in building it and how it could be used in the use case that Chris walked us through. Why is this important? How do we currently measure value? Why is this different? Do we currently measure value, or is this something that's new and different? Who would like to start?
I think for this Sherry, for my use cases, in relation to the work that we did, we were talking about what could truly be measured. And so if you are trying to persuade somebody to pick a use case or look at some workflow, mine really came up that I could actually put some measurement to that. So it could be reduction of first-time denials, or being able to provide and get all your dollars for care delivered. So in relationship back to the work that we did, I think that kind of corresponds to that value that when Chris was showing the spreadsheets, whether that be financial, whether that be foundational, what is the value? And I think everybody looks at that differently. So mine were pretty easy to kind of equate to a measure, and I think some were not as easy.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Would anyone else like to chime in?
Well, I think one thing that an analyst that I worked with a long time ago, and threw this axiom at me, and I think probably a lot of you have heard it: data get better with use, right? Interoperability is a way for us to use data more and more optimally. And so I was thinking about this as kind of like the Hawthorne effect, right? Where if you shine a light on something, people pay more attention to it. So if we can use interoperability as a lever to shine more light on data, the data will get better, and that will in turn increase its value. And then, way down the line, the long-term value proposition is better care.
Yeah, Thank you, Sarah. One point, Sherry, that you brought up is that within your use cases, you were able in a lot of ways to kind of put some numbers and specific value to the points of value identified in the spreadsheet, but that's not true for every single row in the spreadsheet. So everyone isn't tied to a number. Do you all feel that the numbers are something that is necessarily needed there? Is that, a piece that you can continue to build on? Or is that level of specificity not necessarily required to make this useful?
Well, I think that the fellows had a long discussion about this, about value. And I think the numbers will come. So a lot of these use cases are early in development, and you're not going to be able to assign a number value to them until they're implemented, till you can demonstrate that they have had a value effect. That's not to say we weren't able to see the potential value in so many of these. And, I think we have typically thought of the EHR as like, are we capturing everything we can bill for? And now we're trying to think about the EHR and how can it improve time to diagnosis? How can it improve compliance with standards? How can it support clinical decision support, as Grace referred to earlier? How can it decrease the time to find the data that you need, right? If you have a clinical researcher who has to pull data by hand, well, that's not an efficient use of time in this day and age, right? So I think ultimately, I think we will be able to put numbers to a lot of these things in terms of cost savings, time saving, increased compliance to standards, all sorts of things. But we're early enough in the process for many of them that we haven't been able to put a specific number to that yet.
Yeah, I think Rachel's absolutely spot on about that. And I'll just add two maybe cautions to go with that, or maybe caveats is a better way. So the numbers I think are really important, and we should never lose sight of them. As a person who works in data warehousing, it's my role very much so to deliver the data that make the numbers. I mean, that's ultimately what people are looking for from my work. But one of the lessons I've actually learned about that too is that the numbers that we can deliver are usually just the easiest things to count. There's almost always other stuff that we care about, but we can't put it into a number. And I mean, it's why we still have clinicians, right? Because we can't just run it through a machine. And so in assessing, a do it or not kind of decision about implementing something, we don't want anyone to fall into the trap of just like, oh, well, the numbers don't pan out, so we're not going to do it. It's like you actually need to have a bit more imagination. And just as an example of why I think that is, imagine you're running an office in the early 90s and you're doing everything on paper, and somebody says, hey, there's this thing called email. And you're like, great, how much money is it going to save me? You could come up with that number, but it so vastly underestimates the actual impact and importance. I mean, this is kind of going back to, when you bring in these fundamental standards that change the game, you start doing things that you never even thought of. I mean, spam mail that we all deal with on a regular day became a business model because of email. That's a negative one. But also the ability to alert everyone immediately in your building about a crisis right now became an option. And those are things that we never would have been able to account for in counting because we hadn't done it before. So I think the numbers are really important for us to look at, but it's critical to make sure that they only get part of the space in the decision making and not the entire space.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, I like to think about, why is it that people are asking for numbers? Why do they want to know the ROI? And part of it from, talking to people is that implementing even one API can be extremely, extremely expensive. It takes a lot of money. It's like it's like an easy bet, it's not just something you can try. And then if it doesn't work out, like, okay, it's fine, go back. A lot of reputational impact is on the line when you try to implement a FHIR project. And to me, when I see that, I say, okay, well, why is that? And And often the answer is it's not really clear, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like when you create going back to email analogy, when you create your own email, your new email, how long does that take you? That takes you maybe a minute max. But the email, the email API equivalent is just as sophisticated as any Fire API. And so there's clearly work that can be done to reduce that catalytic cost, to make it so that we're not so worried about how much this is going to save, this is going to pan out, because you can try it, and then if it doesn't work out, that's okay, but it might work out way more than you ever imagined, just like email, and we just don't know. So
Yeah, and I think that, the importance of this value metric framework kind of highlights all of that, right? It allows people who are using this document to find that common or that red thread between the work that you're trying to achieve and the people who are at the table with you, or the people that you want to bring to the table. So, and I think the future iterations of this fellowship program and what we've developed with the value metric framework will only build on top of that, to the point where they can just identify one point of value and that would be good enough. But to simply focus just on the dollars and cents, I think that could potentially be a crutch in holding this all back. And we do have to look at other points of value to really drive this type of work forward.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for those perspectives. So switching gears just a bit, I know in at least one of the use cases, one of the interviewees discussed the ways in which interoperability can improve equity or reduce inequities and disparities within healthcare. So Sarah, given your work with the Gravity Project, I'd like to start with you just to kind of share some of those learnings from stakeholders that you spoke with.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. For me, I thought, as I reflected on this, I feel like the dimensions of equity played out in a couple of different ways with the accelerators I worked with. First, Gravity is obviously, it's centered on reducing health inequities by making social needs easier to assess, help connect people with appropriate services. As I mentioned earlier, these might be interventions related to safety, transportation, housing, food insecurity. And they're continuing to build this out into other aspects that keep people from attaining equitable and effective healthcare and true well-being. And then with respect to Codex, again, their goal is accelerating clinical trial matching services by making a minimum set of common oncology data elements more standardized and more ubiquitous. And you're kind of like, okay, Sarah, I'm not seeing the connection with equity here. But I can tell you that especially, not completely, but especially with respect to health equity and cancer treatment, as it stands right now, there's been 30 or 40 years of stubborn lack of enrollment in oncology trials for meeting 5 to 7 patients in adult oncology get onto trials. So 90% plus do not. And that's the gold standard for cancer care. It's been studied a lot. There's a lot of things that affect this, but one of the keys is that most patients get care out in the community hospitals. They get care not at a top flight cancer center like the Hutch or Dana-Farber. And so these community oncology settings don't necessarily have the resources to do this very manualized, time-consuming process of matching patients by hand. But by identifying oncology common data elements and applying data standards from any EHR, whether it's the community hospital up in Lake Stevens or a large cancer center, anything is going to be an improvement over the current state, but being able to provide a level playing field so patients and clinicians can find trials for which they will be eligible or might be eligible is a huge step forward in terms of more equitable cancer care. And I had not appreciated that going in, but as I started thinking, as I started working with the Codex use case and talking with some of the implementers, it was just really clear that this would be a huge step toward reducing that inequity. And then my very last point is there's this other lovely dimension in the accelerator community where these are all diverse stakeholders that represent patients, clinicians, health systems, communities, payers, professional societies, and vendors. And every voice was regarded equally. These are these accelerator environments are very non-hierarchical structures, which was really welcome and really refreshing, because there's often quite a lot of hierarchy in healthcare, as we all know. So on the whole, the ethos in the communities that I was working with really did apply an equity lens to their work implicitly, if not explicitly. And it was just really, to me, that was such a valuable part of this.
Thank you, Sarah. If anyone else would like to weigh in, please feel free to do so.
I would just say, so I had a similar use case with the schedule of activities in the Vulcan use case, in terms of tracking and including people in clinical trials, no matter where they get their care. But I think there's also just a real benefit to, we have said before, you don't want tech access to be another social determinant of health, right? And I think the idea that we can make data easy to find and easy to use, tracking of who's getting their mammograms, tracking of appropriate follow-up of incidental clinical findings, that's something we deal with all the time in radiology. If I have to do that myself, then I'm not going to remember to, and it's only the person who themselves is a patient who has access and who feels empowered to track their care, who's going to be sure that they adhere to those guidelines, those recommendations. But if that data is easy to find across health systems, to find out if they got their service at a smaller community hospital, those kinds of things, and I can pull it in when they come to see me, that I think allows for a more equitable approach, and by creating ease in those systems and workflows, we really allow ourselves to track and reach more patients.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so it looks like we are at our time where we want to open the floor for audience Q&A. And we've got a couple of questions that have come through. The first, I would like to invite Dr. Jaffe to join us. We have a question about FHIR standards around genomics data. So I will read this one out. Will the FHIR standard around genomics data include any additional security features such as blockchain or other encryption requirements?
The short answer is FHIR is only part of the stack. FHIR has, as part of Smart on FHIR, OAuth 2 and OpenID. But other security measures, when available, can be added to the stack. FHIR doesn't pretend to be the end-all to all solutions. So if other security measures are needed, they can be provided.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jaffe, for joining us again. Let's see, another question that we have. This is a good one. So imagine that you have the opportunity to pitch for a $50 million grant to a major philanthropic foundation that would accelerate the value of data collection and interoperability for patients, providers, and all. However, philanthropy folks are not technical and they don't know anything about interoperability. So what is the elevator speech that would infuse funds into the interoperability space? Who wants to take a stab at it?
Is Legos not good enough? I felt like Legos was really. I have a 3-year-old right now, so I'm all about the Legos. Yeah, so I think where I would try to start with that is to think about other shifts in technology. So even for non-technical people, I think the only comparison that we can make that's going to have some weight and some meaning is to look at other shifts in technology which have occurred that have been just as, titanic. So email was the one that I threw out there. I'm sure that if I thought harder about it, or if a group of people trying to get $50 million were to think really hard about it, you could find some sort of comparable shift, not within healthcare, of course, because in healthcare, we're still trying to get there. But perhaps cell phones, as an example, you could find a way there. But it takes some imagination. It takes some storytelling. Even as a technical person myself, just looking at these implementation guides and, I get excited by the ideas of them, but they are dry. And the really good ones are really dry. The less narrative that's included in these implementation guides, actually, the more useful they are, but the less exciting. So I think really storytelling around what's this big problem that we think this is going to solve. Here's the way that I think it solve it. And here's what I want you to imagine as something comparable in the kinds of shifts that we could see with this technology.
Yeah, if I
Laura,
could, oh,
Laura,
sorry.
could you do me a favor and put up slide 4 for my dear friend, Steve Bratt?
Yes, let me work on that. While I do that, I think, Sarah, did you want to weigh in?
I'll just be really quick. I know Grace wanted to make a comment too. I mean, I think from the lead for this in my elevator speech would be COVID and the absolute fractured public health data systems that we have. $50 million would be a nice start. It's not going to be anywhere near enough, but I would lead with the fact that we need interoperable data to avoid another catastrophic data chasm like we've seen in the last 2 years, almost 2 years now.
Yeah, what I was going to say is basically what Sarah said. Like, people die if clinicians don't have the data that they need when they need it. Even if something as simple as an allergy, if you don't know that that patient has the medication allergy, you could kill the patient, the person that comes into your ED. And that's actually, that kind of story actually is what inspired Epic to start Care Everywhere, which is Epic's internal Epic to Epic transfer of information. Is that I think Judy, who's Epic's CEO, her husband had a patient who got seen at a different hospital that didn't know about the allergy status of that patient. And I'm pretty sure, unfortunately, that patient suffered complications and passed away. And so that story was really the major impetus for Care Everywhere. And that's the kind of story that you have to lead with, in my mind, because that's what we're here for, right? Like, we're here to help people and help providers help people.
Thank you. Dr. Jaffe, Nick is helping me with the slides. I had to close.
Okay, so it's the next slide.
The next
It's
one.
the next
Okay.
slide. So I used to start off a presentation with a clinical scenario. It didn't require an MD to understand it. It was about a patient of mine in an oncology setting. And he was a football hero. He had knee pain. They had a knee x-ray. The primary care doctor said he never saw the report. No one ever looked at the film. It showed massive changes in the knee. And when I saw the patient, he had a gigantic lesion in his right lung, which was an osteosarcoma metastatic to the lung. And so had the seamless interoperability that we hope to achieve had been possible, then perhaps the young man would still be here. It's clear that by sharing data, whether it's for COVID, for oncology, or for simple communicable diseases, we would reduce costs and save lives. There are some estimates, the Harvard MIT study said that we physicians kill 250,000 patients a year by avoidable medical errors. Suppose it's only off by a factor of 10, and there are only 25,000 patients we kill. The kind of interoperability that this affords reduces the likelihood for the scenarios for my patient or for the need for public health data in the COVID pandemic. That helps, Steve?
I think so. That was great. Steve says yes. That's awesome. Well, everyone, as you see, we have launched a poll. So just take a couple minutes, I think it's 3 questions, and fill that out. We'd love your input and feedback on today's event. Thank you all for joining today. We are kind of running out of time, but before we close, I'd like to ask each of you what you hope to do with your learnings from the fellowship. So maybe 30 seconds each as we close out, and I'll just go around my screen here. So Chris, I'm going to pick on you first.
Yeah, so I'm rather selfishly trying to figure out how we can use FHIR to really future-proof the work around data warehousing, so that when it comes time to retire a system, bring in a new reporting structure, what have you, we've got some standards in the middle of it that reduce that repetitive work that we're doing over and over again today.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. Sarah.
Oh, sure. So for me, I think the use cases and the case studies as a method, I guess, or as a technique, I'm just going to try to use these as much as possible, because I think what it's done is it helps others find out that there are people who have shared the same challenges you have, and they've found a way through it. So I think this method that we used to do these interviews and work through use cases was, to me, a huge asset I'll take forward. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Grace.
Oh, I'm also like Chris, and I did this purely for selfish motives, and I'm probably going to build some projects around connecting sort of a very light speech-to-text provider dictation software into the EHR, and using this as a way to learn more about FHIR to do that. So,
thank you, Grace. And I would be willing to argue it's not selfish if what you're doing ultimately is benefiting the patient. So, just adding that. Sherry.
So currently in my role, we're looking to replace our legacy system and do an implementation of an EMR and an ERP. And so I think this really gave me the foundation and the language to be able to talk to the vendors and really get what we need to make sure we can decrease. I mean, this has been years and years of interoperability problems. So just really trying to hammer and make improvements.
That's great. Thank you, Sherry, and best of luck with going down that path. Rachel.
I think for me, I really want to continue to push the clinical value, both from the kind of developer side, but also from the provider side. I think in the question about philanthropists, most clinicians don't know what interoperability is, or FHIR, or HL7. So I think that's important as well. And I just wanted to make one other point. Dr. Jaffe showed the QR code and I was recently in France, where everyone's walking around with a QR code with their vaccination status and where they ate dinner and their recent test results. But the idea that you can layer information on there, and the idea that really data, I mean, to me, ultimately, data interoperability is that patients own their data and have control over it. And we forget, this was recently, in a recent conversation, this came up, that we forget when we think about HIPAA, we think the P stands for privacy, but it stands for portability. So our data should be portable and easy to access and use. So I think that working towards that goal, I think, is primary. And lastly, I'll just say I hope to stay in touch with these smart fellows, because it's really been an honor to work with them.
Thank you, Rachel. And Steve, I will let you go next. And then Dr. Jaffe, I'm going to pick on you for some on-the-spot closing remarks, since you're with us.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, for me, it's just to continue to stay involved. I think once you've drank the interoperability Kool-Aid, you can't undrink it, and you just want to stay involved. I think it's really interesting just to reflect back on where I was 3 months ago. I was like shocked. I was like, what did I get myself into? But now I think if you look at the group of fellows on the call here, we're just also passionate about this. So I think, I mean, I speak for myself, I likely for everybody else on here too, is we're just going to want to stay involved, because this has the potential to be a game changer, and we all know it. So.
Thank you, Steve. Dr. Jaffe.
Well, first of all, I want to applaud the work of all of the fellows. I think it was a remarkable opportunity to learn about something I think the next steps are just as great as you can imagine. The possibilities that the implementation division provides is just so vast. One of the things that they all mentioned was that we're using resources or profiles that can be used elsewhere. And of course, CDS Hooks was envisioned for clinical decision support, but it's now used for a myriad of things unrelated to patient care. And that'll be true of a lot of the Legos upon which FHIR has been built. So again, thanks to Cambia Grove and thanks to all the fellows for some incredible work. My applause go out to you. And I welcome contributions to the vast growing knowledge base from everyone who's on this call and their colleagues, because we'll need the collaboration from everyone if this is to fulfill its promise. And thank you to you, Laura, for a great meeting.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the fellows. Thank you, Dr. Jaffe, and the audience here today. There's a few ways to continue to explore this work. So please visit our fellowship page on our website for more information about this year's cohort. The full bios of our fellows are on that page. Their final summaries of their work products and the Excel sheet that Chris walked us through, the magical spreadsheet as Grace called it, will also be housed on our website. Additionally, I'll share 2 upcoming highlights on our calendar. So each year, Cambia Grove hosts the Trails competition, which connects startups to key stakeholders within the healthcare system. This year, we're focused on solutions that address the challenges of those living with behavioral health diagnoses. We have partnered with the Multicare Behavioral Health Network and the Providence Digital Innovation Group for this year's competition and grand prize. So full details and a link to the application can be found on our website. Startups, please apply. Our applications are due on October 31st, and please feel free to share with your network. The other event I would like to highlight is that on November 2nd, we're hosting our next Under the Boughs conversation with Lee Huntsman. He's the University of Washington President Emeritus, and he will be speaking with Dr. Nwando Anyoku, who is the Chief Health Equity Officer for Swedish Health Services. Dr. Anyoku is leading the organization's programs to measure equity in care delivery and outcomes to improve access for patients from all backgrounds and promote culturally competent care. So these will be two exciting events that are coming up on our calendar. As a reminder, we did record this session. It will be available on our website, but we will also send it to you in a link with a recap next week with a post-show write-up. So with that, I would like to say just one final thank you to all of those who participated, not only in today's program, but in the months leading up to today to support these fellows and this work. We look forward to remaining connected. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.